Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Luke Syson, the director of the Fitzwilliam, standing here in Gallery 3 to welcome you to this year's Sue and Ian Purdy lecture, especially designed for the friends of the Fitzwilliam. Our beloved friends who have stuck with us so patiently and so loyally during this difficult period. We hope that many of you have been able to visit the museum in between the two lockdowns and will come back now that the latest lockdown has ended and spend some quiet, contemplative time with these extraordinary works of art over Christmas. In the meantime, we've been adapting to this new world that we're in and trying to stay in touch with you as best we can, launching our new e-newsletter to keep you in touch with everything that's happening here. And from the new year, we'll be launching a series of virtual events that will take us through till May next year. Until we can guarantee that we can gather safely, that seems like the most sensible way of listening to a lecture. So this, in a way, will be the first of many such events, and I'm delighted that this evening the head of research at the Hamilton Carr Institute, Spike Bucklow, is going to be the first of a series of virtual lecturers. Spike is a scientist and an art historian of enormous distinction, whose works have reached not just a scholarly audience, but a much wider one, who, through reading his books, can unlock the secrets of painters' techniques and intentions over hundreds of years. That's an important part of the teaching that happens at the Hamilton Carr Institute at the HKI. One of the great places to learn about the conservation of painting, wall painting and easel painting from the Middle Ages till pretty much now. The task of the students over their 3-year diploma period, and we're very grateful to the Deborah Loeb Bryce Foundation for the support of students coming to the HKI, one of their key tasks is to really understand those techniques, and they do so by copying a work of art, usually one at the Fitz, from scratch. And that's exactly what Spike is going to talk to us about this evening. He's going to be talking from the Sheba Gallery, where the exhibition, Sharpening Perceptions, is on until January the 10th. It's an exhibition that I hope Spike is as proud of as we are. It's really fascinating. So please enjoy the lecture, and as you think of questions, put them into the Q&A, and so that way we can have a rich discussion following this lecture. So, over to you, Spike.
Thank you, Luke, for your introduction, and thank you also for the opportunity to talk about this exhibition, Sharpening Perceptions. Sharpening Perceptions is an exhibition of a few paintings from the Fitzwilliam Museum, together with copies of them by students from the Hamilton Carr Institute. They copy the paintings as part of their 3-year postgraduate training, and at the same time as copying them, they're also cleaning the painting. I called it Sharpening Perceptions because the idea of getting students to copy paintings is to make them interrogate the painting very in great detail. And there's no better way of looking at something than trying to copy it. It makes you look at every single detail. Now, they don't only look with the naked eye, they also look down stereo microscopes, which we've got at the Hamilton Carr Institute. And we also use technologies that maybe we don't have, but we can get access to by collaboration with others. So, for example, there's a painting I won't talk about much because I've written an entire book about it. And it's called, the painting's called The Paston Treasure. It's in Norwich. And as part of a collaboration with Yale, I got the University of Catania to come and look at it with a scanning macro XRF machine, which tells you all the elements that are in a painting. So there's a detail from this analytical thing which tells you that the lobster in that painting, it has got a lot of mercury in it, and there's also arsenic and cobalt. And we take all this kind of information to make a copy, or to get the student to make a copy of not what the painting looks like, but what they know it originally looked like. In other words, they're copying the process of making a painting rather than the finished product that we see now. That makes them interrogate the painting in terms of how the artist, the techniques of the artist, but also how time has changed that painting. So with the lobster, you can see that the copy that the student has made is bright red, but the original is rather faded. The original and the copy here are slightly different from most of them in this room because the copy is done by a first year. Everything else in this room is done by third years at the end of their course. But the idea of getting someone to copy a painting at the beginning of the course is to give them confidence coordinating their hand and their eye. Because these students don't all come from a art background. In fact, this person didn't come from a fine art background. This is the very first egg tempera poplar painting she did. And the other reason for getting a student to do it at the beginning of the course is to slightly scare them about the nature of paintings. The original looks like solid gold background, but in fact the gold is about 100 times thinner than a cigarette paper. And the only way you get to appreciate that is by trying to copy it and use that same material. It gives you a visceral understanding of quite how vulnerable a painting is. I've used this as an example also of another investigative technique that we use to look at paintings before cleaning them, or in this case copying them. And this is, I've included an image of a UV, an ultraviolet image of this painting. And ultraviolet allows the painting to fluoresce, giving off visible light. And I hope you can see on the UV image there's a dark patch on the virgin's throat. And that shows where something is not fluorescing, or where the fluorescence of the original paint is masked by overpaint. So it's one of those clues that makes you go back and look at the original even closer to try and work out what's going on. This student copy of this original 17th century painting is guided by an examination technique called infrared. I've shown you a UV that involves fluorescence. This involves light radiation that goes deeper into the paint layer and therefore can show you what's going on in preparatory stages. And the infrared shows a pencil line which is planning out where the clouds should be. The artist hasn't automatically followed all of those lines, but at least they're there to be shown. And whereas the first example I showed you was unlike the others because the copy was different, it was a first year rather than a third year copy. Here, what's different is the original painting. All of the other paintings in this exhibition have been restored, and this one has been cleaned but not restored. And therefore it shows the level of damage which is associated with paintings that is usually hidden. So at the end of the exhibition, this painting will go back to the Hamilton Carr Institute and will be restored, and damages will be hidden. And the most obvious thing really is the fact that this is on two boards of wood and they've come apart, and so there's a gap. And also it's been rather aggressively cleaned in the past and abraded some of the paint layers, showing the wood underneath. And again, we would hide that. I'll use this painting by Delacroix as an example to show X-ray, which is another way in which we examine paintings to understand their structure. The X-ray shows 4 bits of wood going around the stretcher, and then 2 crossing to keep it rectangular, and then it's very obvious showing the nails that are holding the canvas to the stretcher. But it's very, very little obvious paint in the X-ray. There's just some paint that corresponds to the lion's proper left elbow, and that's about it. So it's another example of how little paint is used to create an image, The copy here by the student is taking different parts of the image to different levels of completion. So really it's just the face, the left arm and the snake that are completed. And the rest of the areas show bare canvas priming and washes of oil to create the image within a very rough outline. This kind of painting requires the student to learn not the formulaic, methodical way of painting in earlier examples, but how to be idiosyncratic and non-systematic, and therefore it's much more difficult kind of thing for the student to copy. This is a third year copy of a painting by Van Dyck, and Van Dyck was renowned for his speed of painting and the apparent effortlessness of it. And that makes it an extraordinarily challenging thing to try and copy, because if you imagine trying to copy someone's signature, it looks very laboured if you're focusing on and copying it. And it takes a lot of practice to be able to forge essentially a signature. So every single one of these brush strokes is like a signature because it was so quick and so effortless in the original. And the student has done, I think, a very good job in copying the way in which Van Dyck worked, whilst not necessarily exactly following the exact shapes. So there's significant differences between the eyes in this copy and the eyes in the original, but the way in which the student has approached the eye is very true to the spirit of Van Dyck. And you can see that in things like the reflection of light off the rim of the eye. Like all of the other copies, parts of it are finished, but parts of it are left to show the hidden structure of the painting. So the canvas, the ground layers, and then the gradual preparation towards those final flourishes which make Van Dyck so recognizable. This student copy is a very good example of how important layers that are hidden in the painting are, and how, even though you can't see them, they make a very big difference to the finished finished effect. So the very top left-hand corner is the original is the student's copy of the original priming. This was an industrially produced canvas that was ready, prepared and sold with white paint on it to the artist. And the first thing the artist did was this rather bright orange, very sketchy, slightly transparent orange that goes over the whole of the painting. That's then followed by a darker, sketchy brown that again goes over the whole pretty much the whole painting. And the white paint that you see in the dress has got a very nice diaphanous satin-like, slightly cool blue look to it. Not that it's using those pigments, but because of the bright orange underlayer. And it's kind of surprising if you look at the original to think that the warmth and the bringing together of the background, the chair, the costume is all due to a bright orange that you hardly even see. But you can, if you look for it, which is what the student obviously had to do, work out that it's underneath everything and it's between every single paint passage. Some of the other copies that I was talking about involved idiosyncratic and very personal gestures by the artist, but this particular copy of Giovanni di Paolo's St. Bartholomew is very formulaic, and the challenge here is to try and understand the formula and then work out how to very systematically build up the painting. And we've got in this in the copy, you can see that it's a panel painting. There's a layer of exposed panel at the bottom left-hand corner. Around that is what's called gesso grosso, which is a kind of coarse priming layer. And there are lots of layers of that. And then there are quite a few layers of gesso sottile, which is smoother, that goes over the whole thing as well. And then the brown stuff that you see is Armenian bowl. It's a clay, and that's painted over everything underneath the original, apart from the flesh and the red robe. So it's under everything apart from those two paint passages. And on top of that is gold. So gold goes over the whole of it as well, apart from the flesh and the red. So there's gold underneath the blue drapery and the green drapery, which the student has worked up to a certain extent. And you can see just below the Bible, or around the Bible, is where it's most complete. And there she's finished the modelling of the blue drapery and the green drapery, and then taken a soft pointed stick, a bit like a cocktail stick, and then scraped the paint off the blue and the green to reveal the gold underneath. This is called sgraffito. This copy shows very well how the gilded background has changed over time. If you look at the original, it's so thin that as it's been cleaned, it's been worn away, and you can actually see the some of the underlying clay. And also the punched bits that are deeper into the clay have filled up with dirt, whereas on the original, on the copy, it is behaving the way it was originally intended to behave, in terms of the way the light plays off the surface as a light source changes. It should be seen under candle, but it's still evident just moving lights around. The other copies, the other originals and copies that I've talked about so far have been on canvas or on wooden panels. And this one is different because it's on a copper panel. Copper panels are very thin, which means that they don't generally tend to get much bigger than this. And the small scale of the painting, because of the vulnerability of the copper support, encourages close viewing. And that close viewing is rewarded by the fact that copper has a very, very smooth surface. Canvas tends to be quite rough, wood can be quite a lot smoother, but the very smoothest surface to paint on is copper, and that gives you an enamel-like or a jewel-like surface. So they tend to be highly detailed and highly finished paintings, and indeed this one is. This is a very nice methodical copy of a very nice methodical original. And on the copy, on the top right-hand corner, you can see the bare oak that is obviously underneath the whole panel. Beneath that is a layer of chalk in animal glue that's very, very thin, and it's just about enough to cover the grain of the wood. To the left of that, we have a beige paint, which basically just knocks back the white, which would be a bit harsh underneath such a subdued painting. That's followed by pencil drawing of the architecture, and then further to the left we've got just blocking in with opaque colours the general elements of that underdrawn interior. Then the next on the left is making those blocked out areas a bit more saturated with more transparent colours and more detail. And then on the extreme left, the student has taken the painting to a level of completion. Now you might notice in the copy there are two parallel lines running horizontally at the top and three running vertically on the right-hand side. And when the student had this original panel in the studio to clean it, she looked on the back, because obviously we do structural work on the back of paintings, and she noticed a number of holes in the back of the panel at regular intervals, and she realized that they were tacks that had been put there to stretch cotton threads, and those cotton threads were stretched at the point where the whole panel was painted beige before the pencil drawing was done. And those cotton threads, which originally for a while covered the whole panel, were a grid that allowed the artist to scale up their drawing onto this panel from probably a piece of paper that was maybe about a quarter of the size, that they'd done a sketch inside a church. So it's quite nice to see the process of making it, not just in terms of the layers of paint, but also how you scale things up from other objects that are in your studio. This flower painting by Jan van Huysum is canvas on a stretcher. The canvas is pulled over a wooden framework and nailed to it. And it started off life in the studio looking like this, which is canvas on a loom. So the loom has to hold a canvas that's bigger that's going to go on the stretcher. But originally, this is how the Van Huysum was painted. And this student copy shows not only the way in which the canvas is bound to the loom, very taut, but also that the first layer that goes on, the priming layer, is a kind of darkish mid-tone brown. And rather than other paintings which I've shown, which have got a carbon pencil underdrawing, this is a white chalk underdrawing, and it defines the vague areas that are going to build up to become the painting. And the first thing that's done is to put a very transparent dark colour in all of the background so that the light can go into the painting, disappear into the painting and never come back out again. And that leaves the areas where leaves and flowers are going to be with just this mid-tone underlayer showing. That's a reserve that is then painted lighter, and you can see that's a grey layer that's going to build towards the white flower that's there. And this way of painting creates a very big contrast between the subject matter, be it a flower or a leaf, and the background. And it creates a very powerful, almost like a firework display of three-dimensionality, a feeling of great depth to the painting that is due to this mid-tone to dark background, just absorbing all of the light. This is another 18th century flower painting, but unlike the previous one, it's on a mahogany panel. But the major difference is that that mahogany panel is coated with a white layer rather than a dark layer. And that white layer allows the light to penetrate into the painting and then bounce back out. Whereas with the dark layer in the Van Huysum, the light just disappeared into the painting and never came out again. And the effect of that is means that you cannot have this feeling of incredible pictorial depth that was in the Van Huysum. Instead, you've got much more of a two-dimensional, rather a frothy surface effect than a 3D illusionistic effect. And in fact, Jan van Os here was inspired by Japanese block print, so he is going for a two-dimensional pattern. And as with the other flower painting, you're not necessarily seeing an arrangement that was in the studio, because before temperature-controlled transport, there was no, you couldn't assemble all these things together. They would ripen at different times or bloom at different times, and it would literally take a year to paint a painting like this, which meant that you needed a very methodical approach with a very detailed underdrawing. In this case, the underdrawing is carbon black, whereas the previous case it was white chalk. And I want to talk through the layer structure of how to, in a very formulaic way, create a a grape. The first layer is a very pale yellow. That's over all of the white grapes. That's followed by a pale green that may be over all of a grape or just part of a grape. And in this case, they both look very flat because both these paints are opaque paints and they reflect light off the surface. So the third paint layer goes on, which is a glaze to cover it in a transparent yellow that makes it start to look a bit more translucent. Then the fourth glaze goes on top, which is a kind of shadow, this is modelled to give you the kind of translucency of a grape. Then there's a fifth layer, which is opaque white, and that's blended to make the bloom effect. And the final sixth layer of paint is the same lead white that was used in the bloom, but with a different medium, so the brush strokes stay, and that gives you the effect of reflections off the grapes. If you imagine that each layer of paint takes 3 or 4 days to dry, then doing this would take between 18 and 24 days, and no bunch of grapes lasts that long, which is why you need planning. There's a similar kind of methodical build-up to the black grapes, but there are 2 different types of black grape that are in shadow and black grape that have got light coming through. They've all got this pale purple underlayer, but if they're in shadow, then it's followed by a darker purple, but if they're in the light, it's followed by a pillar box red. And then you build on top of that a dark colour, then the same white to give bloom, and the same white to give reflections. This is such a methodical kind of painting that you know in advance, a year in advance, what you intend to do, and you gradually construct it over time. And very rarely do you get it wrong. Van Os got this wrong because he discovered that by the time he painted his mouse, it disappeared against the black grapes. So he had to put in some white grapes behind the mouse to make it show up. But now, because the painting has become more transparent, you can see the blue grapes, the black grapes, coming through. But he made very few mistakes. I want to return to this picture to talk about layers of paint again. But all of these layers are about 1/1000th of a millimetre thick, so it's very, very difficult to see them. Whereas the paint layer I want to return to is very obvious when lit in an appropriate way. And to kind of introduce that idea, I want to go back to an early Italian type of painting, which shows surface effects much more obviously. Well, all of the copies I've talked about so far have fulfilled 2 functions. One of them is research for the student who is working on the painting, and the second is a teaching resource for later students who come after them. Because they have unfinished areas, they show the build-up quite graphically. However, I want to talk about, very briefly, one reconstruction that we were involved in that went to completion because it's fulfilling a different role. It's a half-scale crucifix by Cimabue, and whilst it's not in the Fitzwilliam Museum, it is in Cambridge, so if you want, you can go and see it. Well, the first thing to do was to make a wooden carcass out of poplar. The next thing to do was to mix up the gesso layers, and here you see the mixing of gesso, and here the application of dozens of layers of gesso over the carcass. That's followed by, in the areas where you want gilding, the Armenian bowl that you saw also on the copy of St. Bartholomew earlier. That covered with gold using gilder's tip, as shown in the exhibition, and then burnished with agate burnisher to make it look like it's solid gold, and then decorate the gold by punching into the clay so that at different angles it catches the light in an interesting way. That's the crucifix with one load of gilding finished. It's then all of the egg tempera painting is done, and that's followed by another form of gilding which is called oil gilding, where you paint on oil, drop gold leaf on, and then brush the stuff that's not stuck off, and you end up with a slightly different texture of gold. This is the mordant for Christ's loincloth. This is it covered in gold that's then being taken off to reveal the pattern. And this slide shows 1/1000th of a millimeter of vermilion covered by 200 nanometers of gold. And it's an absolutely spectacular effect. The final work is available to see in Fisher Hall, and whilst physically it is a faithful reconstruction of a Cimabue crucifix, it is in a very different architectural setting, and that means that all of the work that's gone into the surface details is not seen to its best effect. It should be in a very dark church with candlelight catching the gold at different angles. But we have the same issue about lighting in the Fitzwilliam Museum, because here's a photograph of a gallery, and that's where the painting that I want to return to talk about the tulip it hangs. And it's very difficult to see the effect that was required in the tulip, because it's a surface effect and it's lit with very diffuse light. That light is intentional, and here you see a slide of a cross-section through the Fitzwilliam Museum, the founder's entrance, showing two sources of light, and there's another image shows the cross-section through galleries, the Royal Academy, the National Gallery, and a number of others, with, I hope you can make out, traces of rays coming through the top lights in the ceiling to bounce off walls, so that they knew where glare would be, and they could control the way the light fell on the painting. But this assumes that paintings are flat, and that's not actually the case. Here I've got two images of Dutch interiors in Old Dutch paintings, and they both have paintings of paintings in the background. In one of them, a landscape, you can see that the light goes racing across the surface of the painting and leaving half of it in shadow. In the other, you can see that the light bounces off the varnish. And so on the right-hand side, in the corridor, there is a painting of a portrait with a man with a black beard and a white ruff. But the artist who paints this is less interested in the portrait and more interested in the way the light bounces off the varnish, which is very similar to the way the light is bouncing off the door. And that tells you that this is a panel painting, not a canvas painting. So these things, surfaces, were appreciated by artists. And this is the way the tulip in the Van Os painting looks when it is lit under gallery conditions. But this is what it looks like if the light is skating across the surface. And you can see from this, and you can see in the original if you come to the Sheba Gallery, that rather than being paint layers that are 1/1000th of a millimeter thick, this is very substantial paint layer. And it makes you realize that what looks like an awful lot of work painting this tulip is actually half of it done by the light. So whereas this tulip involves 5 layers of paint and therefore maybe 20 days waiting for each thing to dry, in terms of activity, it probably took less than 3 minutes. And this is the kind of thing you can only learn from making a reconstruction. So I want to finish by just thanking everybody who was involved, and I can't go through all their names, but they have moved on from the Institute and they are now gainfully employed as conservators in these different galleries and practices. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you'll be able to come to the Fitzwilliam Museum. This exhibition should be up for another month, but in the meantime, if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.
Brilliant. Spike, thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating insight. I must say, when I started working at the National Gallery, I suppose nearly 20 years ago, it was that conversion of the image into the object that was such a startling thing when you're actually working with paintings on a day-to-day basis, that sense that they're actually three-dimensional as well as it were, ostensibly flat. And I think what you showed today was how intimately you can get to know an object in that way. Before I move to questions, I just want to again thank Sue and Ian Purdy for ensuring that this lecture happens every year. Their son Sean is with us this evening, and I'm sure he will have enjoyed hearing Spike as much as we have. I'm going to be looking at the questions in the Q&A. So just to remind everybody that if you want to ask a question, just press on that button on the bottom of your screen and type your question in. So I'm just going to start with a few fairly straightforward ones, I think. Spike, in terms of the students at the Hamilton Carr at the HKI, who comes mostly from a scientific background, say, versus an art historical or fine art education? What are they coming equipped with on the whole?
It's a pretty even split. So, I mean, I off the top of my head, I can't give you a figure, but at the moment we have a student who did chemistry and another one who did modern languages. But it's a pretty even split. There are more who've done a humanities subject or a science subject than fine art, but we've had all of them. And my job really is to try and teach a bit of humanities to the scientists, teach a bit of science to the humanities people, and get everybody confident with using their hands and eyes. And we do like to have people from different disciplines, so not from a conservation undergraduate course, just because they are bringing different skills into the profession.
And so in terms of the copying process, is there a kind of a clear division between those who have been more sort of technically trained themselves as practicing artists and those who come from other backgrounds? Or do you find that people are equally kind of, as it were, getting used to this process as they tackle their copy?
It's really hard to predict, actually, how somebody's going to perform as a copyist. And whilst you might think that somebody from a fine art background has an advantage, they've actually got a disadvantage because they have lots of practice essentially expressing themselves. And that's not what we want. We want somebody who has really quite technical skills where they can, if you like, leave their ego at the door and follow what they see as faithfully as possible. And that's a hard lesson for someone who's had a fine art training to do. But like I say, it's hard to predict.
It's an interesting consideration. I was thinking, listening to you, that for one of the things that's sort of striking about the way we celebrate painting nowadays is that it's rarely celebrated in terms of craft and the way that we might laud a furniture maker or a potter. And yet what you've demonstrated so sort of clearly is that that as much of what we see is the result of learning how to do something, a technique, as it is of inspiration. And maybe it's what's that expression, 90% grind and 10% inspiration, or something like that. How do you feel about that aspect?
I'm extraordinarily proud of the Hamilton Carr Institute and the teaching that is done there, because it is, as far as I know, the nearest thing to the kind of craft apprenticeship that, say, a 17th century painter would have undergone themselves. We have separated out conservation as a kind of technical thing that are done by people in white coats, but that's a very recent phenomenon. And it only became professionalized maybe 70 years ago. Before that, if you wanted a painting to be conserved, it was done by a painter. And we know, for example, that Gainsborough, most of what Gainsborough learned was learned through cleaning Dutch paintings that are 100 years older, and just very good close observation. So you're absolutely right. We don't now generally think in terms of craft. However, craft is absolutely essential. And it's very good that the Institute is, within a university setting and an academic context, able to maintain the craft idea of an apprenticeship.
And just a final question on these, on the sort of process. Who chooses the pictures that the students copy? Is that you, Spike, or do they get a say, or is this a peculiar form of torture that you invent per personality, or how does it work?
No, this is another thing that I'm very proud of about the Institute. Because we cannot take many students, they have to be very, very closely supervised. Obviously, they're working on real paintings with real deadlines, real clients. They do require very close supervision. That keeps the numbers down. And with a very small number of students, you can't really teach them like cattle and give them jobs. It is very egalitarian. And yes, the student generally chooses what they want to copy. That is, of course, within certain logistic constraints. So we have to agree, if it's something in the Fitzwilliam store, then usually there's no problem. But if it's on the wall, on display, then that has to be factored into, taking it down and what else is going to go in its place. And if it is for a non-Fitzwilliam painting that they want to copy, then the time scale of the treatment for the client has to be taken into account. But the student has the, within those constraints, the student has the main choice. So, for example, the third year, one of the third years is actually going to copy, and I'm really quite pleased about this because it's a new thing we haven't done before, some Constable skyscape sketches from the Fitz. So this is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that somebody has tried to copy a sketch rather than a painting. Whatever the difference between a sketch and a painting is, we can debate. But I was very pleased that that's what they wanted to do.
And when you're following the process of the copy, have you and the fellow scholars, your fellow teachers at the Hamilton Carr, been surprised by what they've discovered and what they've uncovered, as if you like, almost literally in the process?
Yeah,
I mean, it's the best part of the course, really, from my point of view. It's a real treasure to be able to spend time with someone looking at that, looking in such detail. And off the top of my head, I'd have to say, to give you an example, there's a Canaletto in the Fitzwilliam of the Doge's Palace, an interior courtyard, that didn't get to be in the exhibition for various reasons, but is it was a wonderful thing for me, because it's a very nice small panel, lots of detail, and like I say, we do all these examination techniques like infrared, X-rays, and the like before doing a treatment or before copying. And I thought Canaletto X-ray, you're going to have all these lovely little fine lines of the architectural details. I was absolutely amazed that it just looked like a weather front in the North Atlantic. It was, I could almost discern no pattern to it at all. And I just thought, what's going on? What is Canaletto playing at? Because the X-ray, you could hardly find the buildings. There was only one line in that X-ray that made any sense to me. And it was actually the cast shadow of one building across another. And it completely changed the way I understood what Canaletto was doing, that the only feature he was interested in really was sunlight, and everything else was just playing second fiddle to the sun.
That's absolutely fascinating. And it is amazing, isn't it, how painters go on surprising you, even though you think there are rules for rules for the way in which pictures are executed. So some questions have been coming in now from our friends. There's also some very nice praise. So Elizabeth Bard just said how fascinating your talk is. And so I think that's not really a question. You just have to agree to that, Spike. But Feruza Melville was just asking about some of the students themselves. You haven't mentioned their names, and she's wondering if you're keeping them anonymous or...
Oh, no.
But they're...
No, I'm not mentioning names just because logistically, I didn't know when we were recording this in the Sheba Gallery how long it took, and I didn't think there'd be time. But no, there's absolutely no anonymity about it at all. If you go to look at the paintings, they have the artist's name on there. In fact, there was a detail shown, the church interior, the Dutch 17th century Dutch church interior. There was a detail shown with the two cotton threads running across, and the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted Daniela Fixit 2005. She signed it in exactly the same place and exactly the same way as the original artist had signed it. And I thought that was a nice touch. No, there's no anonymity at all. They are fully acknowledged in the labels. The label for the original is done in exactly the same style as the label for the copy, and we are putting them equal billing. And the other nice thing about the labels actually is we've given the list of ingredients of each painting on the label. So you can see what it was that was used to make those paintings.
That's brilliant. Yes, so another incentive to come and see the exhibition. And I think it's worth saying how many of the really great restorers in working across museums in North America, Europe, and much further afield had their professional training at the HKI. In my last two roles at the Met and the National Gallery, worked closely with the heads of paintings conservation in both places, both of them Hamilton Carr alumni, so Larry Keith and Michael Gallagher. So another question then, and I guess this is sometimes going to be part of the copying process as well. I'm not sure the degree which this always happens, but Do you sometimes clean the pictures in order to copy them? And in general, this is a question from Penelope Robson. When do you decide when you can restore or clean a picture, and when should you leave it alone? Are there any general?
It's a very good question, the short answer is we decide in discussion with the owner or the curator or the art historian who knows most about the artist. So there's no simple answer, but also there's different levels of cleaning. You can just remove the surface dirt. That's a relatively easy thing to do and not very contentious. You can remove the varnish, which is a greater intervention, or you can remove the surface dirt, the varnish, and overpaints when you're starting to get more invasive. And so the questions really mount up depending on how far you clean. But in terms of the student copies, there would be no point a student trying to copy a painting through its dirty varnish, surface dirt, and overpaint. So I said earlier that the student gets the choice, but that's one of the logistic things that might constrain their choices, because we have to then say, okay, well, is this something that we can clean or that they can clean? Most of the work that they do is cleaning paintings where that's primarily the purpose. So this is a little 2 or 3 months at the end of the course when they have a choice about cleaning something or not.
Brilliant. So a very particular question now around Armenian bowl. So what's the binding medium for the bowl that goes onto the gesso, and what makes the gold leaf stick onto it?
Armenian bowl is just a red clay. Whether it actually comes from Armenia or not, I don't hand on heart know, but originally it did. And it's the same binding medium as the gesso or the chalk. Thank you, Luke, for asking this question, because...
Well, this is Caroline Postgate, actually. Carolyn. Sorry.
Thank you very much for asking this question, because there are some very, very basic things about paint. Paint is two things. It is a powder, which is color, and a colorless liquid that allows you to distribute it as a medium, but then once you've distributed it, it turns into a solid and binds it in place. So you can vary the pigments or you can vary the media. In the ground layers, the medium is nearly always animal glue. So it is animal glue for the gesso, it's animal glue for the Armenian bowl as well. But the difference is, so you've got the same medium, but the difference is that the pigment is a crystal in gypsum, and it's very hard. But clay is platelets that will slide across each other, which is why, you know, a potter can mold clay. So you've got a very hard crystalline layer, but then you've got another layer on top, which can be deformed. And it sticks, the gold sticks to it just by breathing on the Armenian bowl, and the moisture in your breath activates the glue, and that sticks the clay down, the gold to the clay. But once it's there, you can burnish it. That is rubbing it with an agate. And what that process does is flatten the clay, because the clay is a flexible material. So you can get a mirror flat surface. And the punching, which I showed you with a nail and a hammer, is where the clay is deformed into a recess, but the the gold that's sitting on top of it is so malleable that rather than break, it stretches and fills up that hole. And that's why you get different angles, and under candlelight, why these kinds of things look so spectacular. I mean, I'm perfectly aware you can't possibly have candles in the Fitzwilliam Museum, but that's one of the good things about using the permanent collection to make temporary collections from, because you can change the lighting conditions. And in the case of the St. Bartholomew, it's not going to make a great deal of difference because most of the gold has been abraded. But in the case of the Van Os tulip, it does make a difference because there is directional light in the Sheba Gallery that is not available elsewhere.
So I think it's one of the things, again, that I think many visitors to museums don't always realize. And I must say, I had a revelation the other day standing in front of our Titian, Rape of Lucretia, when the gallery lights were not on, and suddenly understanding how Titian had calculated the different levels of finish in the picture to account for a form of slightly gloomier daylight than we actually provide. So just a last couple of quick questions before we wrap up. Anushka Fox has asked if there's a catalogue for this exhibition, on the basis that, as we've said before, the talk was so fascinating. The answer?
I'm afraid the answer is no, but I would say if you're interested, you could. There is a book that we produced in honor of a colleague at the Institute called In Artists' Footsteps, that is about copying painting. So some of the painting and copies that were featured in the exhibition are already in a book. It's published, I don't know, probably 5 years ago by Archetype Press in London. So it's called In Artists' Footsteps.
Brilliant. And then a very last question, which I think perhaps takes us to the heart of the matter. When you're choosing the students for admission to the HKI, what qualities are you looking for? How do you make that choice, given that, as you say, it's such a small number of people that you can train at any one time?
That's a very difficult question. To be honest, I'm going to say that's more than a 2-minute question.
All right, so that's a question from
2-minute answer.
And I think I can imagine that there's a lot of instinct that comes in.
Well, there's a lot of looking for levels of competence intellectually as well as practically. But there's also things that you cannot actually quantify. You want somebody who is going to be confident but sensitive. And that's quite a difficult combination to assess. You don't want somebody who is gung-ho, because that's really scary. You don't want somebody who is like a rabbit in the headlights, because you are asking them to do a job which is quite scary, and you do have to have a certain level of confidence. But it is a kind of balance between confidence and sensitivity.
I was going to say courage and modesty, but I think
yes, absolutely. Yes,
we're in the same territory.
Yes.
Spike, thank you very much again. And please, everybody who's been listening to this this evening and to our conversation just now, do come along to the Fitz. We're open again as of today. Spike's show is up, as we were saying earlier on, until early January, 8th of January. We will be closed between Christmas and New Year this year for the first time, and for the only time, I hope, thanks to the pandemic. But in general, we are open. And the ticketing system that I hope many of you got used to before the last lockdown is still in operation. We'll be closing one extra day a week as well, on Tuesdays as well as Mondays, just to make sure that those of you who do come don't arrive at our front door on the wrong day. Spike, thank you. Thank you all of you again friends of the Fitzwilliam for being so loyal during these difficult periods. I hope soon that we will be back to normal. The news seemed good this morning. I felt that perhaps we were at the beginning of the end. In the meantime, please take pleasure and comfort from the Fitzwilliam, but above all, come and learn, because that's what the students have come to the Fitzwilliam, to the HKI to do, and what Spike has shown us in this lecture and in his exhibition.